Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate and today I'm going to be doing the first part of my 2022 in review series. It's going to be pretty short. My goal for this is basically today I will be releasing both my best of 2022 and my most disappointing of 2022. I wanted to structure it that way so that if you're someone who really doesn't enjoy negative or critical content, you don't have to watch the most disappointing of 2022. As sort of a spoiler alert, there are going to be pretty hyped books on that list. So if you don't want to hear any criticism of them, just feel free to skip it. This video is going to be my best of. And then coming up probably next week, I will note when I have an exact release date for this. In fact, editing me hopefully has a date figured out. I will be doing a live tier list of all of the books, all 94 books that I read in 2022. I had a really hard time narrowing down to a top 10 for today, so I wanted to have a chance to talk about more of them. I saw a number of people do a live tier list for their 2022 reads, and I just really like that idea. No pressure to attend. I just wanted to actually, I think it'll be my first live show by myself, so that'll be hopefully not too awkward, but that way I can talk more about some of the books that didn't quite make it onto this list. So keep an eye out for that. Again, I should have a date for that by the time I edit this video, so you will see it here on the screen, and I'll also put it in the description for this video. So, like I said, I narrowed my favorites of 2022 down to a list of 10, and challenged by my boyfriend, he called me a coward if I did any more than 10, which is not a judgment on anyone else who has honorable mentions, just that I felt challenged to actually make a 10 with no caveats. So I did that, as painful as it was. I will be counting from 10 up to my favorite, so you can see what my reading was like. And even though I own some of these physically, I am just going to be posting a picture here, so you can see which book I'm talking about, and I don't have to hold it up the whole time because I will have a fair amount here. So, starting at number 10, I have Little Thieves by Margaret Owen. This was a fairly late addition to this list. I buddy read this in November into December with my friend Jess. And I will say right off the bat that now that I'm in my 30s, I have a harder time connecting to young adult fantasy, so I don't tend to read a lot of it anymore. But every once in a while, I run into a book that just blows me away with how much I love the characters and the setting and sort of just the general atmosphere of it, and that was very much the case with Little Thieves. The story follows Vanya Schmidt, who is the adopted daughter of Death and Fortune. She was basically given to them when she was a child because her family couldn't afford to keep feeding so many kids in the family, and they considered her to be unlucky. I believe she was the 13th daughter of a 13th daughter. The story is part a Goose Girl retelling because Vanya is the former maid of a princess, and she used an enchanted necklace to essentially take the place of the princess. It's also part heist story because Vanya uses that elevated station in order to steal from the rich and basically build herself a nest egg so that she can escape the country and escape the contract that has been made with her adopted parents that she will serve one of them until she dies. And so she does not want to be stuck in that position, and so she's trying to find a way out of it. And in the course of this, she ends up invoking a curse on her that causes, because of her greed involved in building this nest egg and escape for herself, she will eventually turn into gems unless she can find a way to break that curse. So that's the basic setup for this. Again, part fairy tale retelling, part heist novel. The main character, Vanya, is incredibly snarky. She's also very prickly because she's gone through a lot in her life. Because she's always been in a poor, sort of lowly station, she's had to make a lot of sacrifices and a lot of choices that aren't necessarily ideal. And that's kind of made her put up a lot of walls between her and the rest of the world. And so you really get to see Vanya come into her own as she navigates this curse and tries to figure out what it's going to take to break it. It has it's definitely very voicey. Either you're going to enjoy the humor and sort of the snark of this, or it's just going to completely turn you off. So it's definitely one that I'd recommend. I loved it way more than I thought I was going to, and I'm super excited that Owen is going to have a sequel to this, where I think Vanya ends up like inadvertently becoming a cult leader, and it just sounds so fun, and I can't wait to pick this one up. Number 9 on my list is The Blacktongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman, which was also a November pick. November and December were great reading months for me, so I ended up having a lot of late entries to this list. But The Blacktongue Thief follows Kinchna Shannock, who is a thief who's been trained by a guild known as the Takers Guild, which basically takes in thieves and trains them up, but also causes them to be in debt to the school, and then they have to perform services for the school. Kinch is tasked with following a knight who is on a sort of dangerous quest in a neighboring kingdom to go find a lost queen. You'll see a theme here, the snark of Kinch, the humor, and the fact that he relies on cleverness and guile over strength to win out in any situation that he runs into. The narrative style for The Blacktongue Thief is again pretty voicey. Kinch is telling you this very rambling tale of how he ended up following along on this quest with the knight Galva, and he does not care about the end result of the quest. He is just along so that he can save his own skin and maybe make a little money on the side if he can. The way that he tells his story is very rambly. He is bringing in elements of the world but not really explaining them, sort of treating the reader like they're a part of the world. So you really have to pick it up as you go. I didn't mind that style at all, but it might be an issue for anybody who who wants a tighter narrative and more explained world building. He's also quite crass, so if you don't like a lot of slang and sort of gutter terminology, then this may not be the book for you. The last thing I'll say about it is that I loved the audiobook for this. I think, bar none, it is my favorite audiobook of the year. It is narrated by Buehlman himself, who adopts a sort of ye old Renaissance fair voice. If you've ever been to a Ren fair, I'm sure you've run into people who adopt this sort of voice that's a total blend of the British Isles. There's English in there, there's Scottish in there, and there's even like a tiny bit of Welsh and Irish. So it's this kind of silly blend, and it made it really fun for me. He also adopts some sort of over-the-top accents for other characters in this story. So the whole tone is very humorous. If the humor doesn't click for you, you will not enjoy this book. So I think if you start it and it's not working for you, then know that it may just not be the book for you. It worked really, really well for me, which is why I ended up loving it. The other thing I will say about the audiobook is that Buehlman got, I believe, one of his friends. I know I can never remember his name off the top of my head, so I'll put it on the screen, but he has done a fair amount of singing and general type bard work at Renaissance fairs. Buehlman himself has worked at Renaissance fairs, but he got him to sing all of the songs that are in this audiobook, and I felt like that really brought a super fun element. I tend to not be a huge fan of songs in fantasy novels if they're not being sung to me. Now, kind of the discovery for me is that I really enjoy them when they are sung by a narrator, but if I'm reading them physically, I might just skim them. So it was a fun added bonus to having the audiobook. Number 8 on this list is actually a manga. It is the only manga that makes this list. It is the only manga that makes this list, but I did have quite a few that I really enjoyed. So it was a little bit hard to narrow down. But number 8 is Spy Family by Tatsuya Endo. I love this manga. I read the first 2 volumes, I think right after the other. It is sort of if you took Mr. and Mrs. Smith and combined it with an adorable found family. The basic concept is that you have a renowned spy, Twilight, who needs to infiltrate an elite private school, and in order to do that, he needs both a wife and a child. So he goes out and he adopts a young girl who, unbeknownst to him, is a telepath, and then he goes and finds a woman who's willing to marry him, sort of a marriage of convenience type situation, because she's getting in trouble at work because she is single. So Yor is the one he ends up getting married to, and again, she doesn't know that he's a spy. He doesn't know that she's an assassin. So there's this really fun, silly, over-the-top dynamic with the whole series that is just so much fun. And there's so many heartwarming moments as they sort of figure out how to be a family together. And the young girl in the family, Anya, has to figure out how to fit into this new school. And she is the only one who knows that her adopted father is a spy and that her adopted mother is an assassin. So it creates this really fun dynamic where she'll come up with comments out of nowhere that kind of throw them, but again, they don't know that she knows. So it's just, if you enjoy sort of silly, heartwarming stories, I really can't recommend that manga enough. It was such a fun time, and I'm super excited to read the rest of the series in 2023 so I can get all caught up. The next book on this list is actually the very last book that I read in 2022, and I honestly didn't expect to be putting it as high up on this list as I did. I loved it, but I didn't expect it to beat out some of these other books that I really enjoyed. So my number 7 pick is Into the Riverlands by Nghi, which is the newest novella in Vaux's Singing Hills cycle. And this whole series of novellas follows a cleric named, I'm going to try and get these names right, cleric named Chi, who travels around with their bird, Almost Brilliant, and basically records stories of the world to take back to the monastery that they work for isn't the right word, that they are committed to. She is going into this dangerous area known as the Riverlands, who are famed for their martial artists, and is trying to find out what stories they would like to pass on to them. And as someone who studied martial arts from a pretty young age, I fell in love with Shotokan Karate when I was growing up. I've been in a number of different related martial arts. There's one that was sort of like a Korean version of Kendo, and it's called Gumdo, if anyone's curious, but I think it's not a terribly well-known art as far as I know. And I grew up watching a lot of martial arts movies. Like, I've always loved kung fu movies, samurai movies, all that sort of thing. And this really appealed to me, the setup for this, not only with the martial artists, but just the characters that Chi runs into. She ends up traveling with a pair of sisters, one of whom basically looks out for the other. One is a martial artist, and one is basically just smoothing the way for her sister. And it was really fun to see that dynamic. And what really pushed this story up this list for me is the way that Vaux talks about stories and the way people are remembered in stories and how things change, what value beauty versus kindness has in how you're remembered. I just really, really loved this novella and the themes that it was exploring in a mere 100 pages. It's absolutely my favorite in the Singing Hills cycle so far, and I think honestly all of those novellas I've given 4 or 5 stars. So this one just really blew my mind. It might be a tiny bit of recency bias because I did read it at the very end of December, but I'd highly recommend it if you're a fan of that. If you enjoy stories that talk about storytelling, and if you enjoy having a sort of an element of martial arts in your fiction and fantasy. So again, absolutely loved it. I am definitely going to buy that when that comes out in paperback. Number 6 on my list is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I honestly thought this would end up higher on my list because I did limit myself to 1 book per author. I read quite a few books by T. Kingfisher this year, but this is the one that stuck with me the most. It is a horror novella that retells the fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe and really expands on that original short story. I felt like while I enjoyed the fall of the House of Usher, I really loved seeing Kingfisher expand on it and give you more reasons for what's going on other than just like a vague spooky vibe, which is what I tend to get from Poe. And I love the way that Kingfisher tells stories. I really enjoyed the creepiness of the rabbits and some of the other elements around this House of Usher. I liked the exploration of gender identity that Kingfisher does. The main character is non-binary, former soldier, and I really liked how Kingfisher integrated not only that non-binary identity, but also their past as a soldier in terms of dealing with some of that PTSD and just sort of their outlook on the world. And again, I really, really loved the way Kingfisher expanded on the horror of this. And I really appreciated the afterword that Kingfisher has in there because she talks about how she almost didn't put this story out because she was so blown away by Mexican Gothic. And I appreciate when authors will talk about some of their qualms and the things that blow them away. So I just adored this novella. It did really stick with me. There are some elements of body horror in it. And I think that I will admit by the end of this novella, I might have wanted to cleanse the house with fire, but that's as far as I will go in talking about my gut reactions to this excellent Gothic horror novella. I will say that if you don't like Gothic horror, don't like the slow pace and the creep vibe more than the outright nasty blood and guts, this may not be the horror novella for you. But I absolutely loved it. Definitely belongs on this list for me. Number 5 on my list is Network Effect by Martha Wells. This is the first full-length novel in the Murderbot series and the 5th book overall. It is followed by a novella, Fugitive Telemetry, but that one's actually takes place prior to Network Effect. So when I read this series this year, as I had started Murderbot, I think 2021, but I ended up this year rereading the first 3 novellas that I had read previously, and then I ended up picking up Exit Strategy, which is book number 4, then Fugitive Telemetry, book 6, technically, which is really more of a murder mystery featuring Murderbot that takes place before Network Effect, and then Network Effect. So I did it more chronologically, and because I had heard from reviews that progression worked better for some people. And I am actually really glad I did that because I ended up loving Fugitive Telemetry, and I don't know if I would have loved it as much if I'd been reading it after Network Effect. because Network Effect sets up something really cool for the future of Murderbot. And I think that more than anything is why I picked it as my representation of what I loved about Murderbot and my pick for this top 10 list. I love the anxiety and the snark of Murderbot. It's so relatable to me because it's the inner voice that I wouldn't say because it's not polite enough. I appreciate that about Murderbot. If you don't like Murderbot's brand of anxious snark, you shouldn't have made it this far in the series, because that is the main vibe for Murderbot and it is the main appeal for Murderbot. I know people felt like Murderbot was overhyped, and I think it's just because those of us who really vibe with that feeling from Murderbot have raved about it, and if you don't connect with that, it's hard to connect with the series. So in Network Effect, Murderbot's humans, who we were introduced to earlier in the series, end up being captured, and Murderbot has to go along to make sure they get home safely. So in this novel, there's banter between some other characters that just really elevated this story for me, and I had such a good time. It really does explore Murderbot's struggles with friendship and emotions, because Murderbot isn't always the best at processing emotions, and really kind of has to try and figure that out. Murderbot is also being paired up with the teen daughter of one of its closest human friends, and that dynamic was very amusing to me because Murderbot is not used to dealing with teenagers, and it was just a fun element to the story. And I think what really elevated this to me above the other installments in this series is really a much better exploration of identity in terms of bot versus AI versus cyborg, all of these different somewhere between machine and human identities, that was done so much better than Rogue Protocol. I felt like Rogue Protocol, Wells had kind of dipped her toes in this concept and was starting to explore it, but here you get a much better, much fuller exploration of that. And I really, really loved the way that Wells handled it. There are some narrative choices that Wells makes towards the end of the book that just really, really worked for me, and I felt like gave me a better character arc for Murderbot and set up some really fun things for the future. So I am really, really excited to see where Wells chooses to take Murderbot. I think the next installment is supposed to be out this year, 2023. So I am super excited to see what happens. I will definitely be picking that up as soon as it's released. And I ended up consuming this story via audiobook. I really like Kevin Free's narration. I know not everybody does, but I think overall most people really like the narration that Free uses for this. Free basically is Murderbot to me because I've consumed the whole series via audio, and it's hard to imagine doing it any other way. But again, if you like anxious robots figuring themselves out and sort of fairly high-octane space adventures, I love the Murderbot series and highly recommend it. Okay, number 4 on this list, getting to the top now, is The Goblin Emperor by Katherine Addison. And to be honest with you, if you had told me that Goblin Emperor would not only be on my top 10, but within the top 5 at the beginning of this year, I would not have believed you. I have always said that I am not a fan of slow-paced, super character-driven political fantasy, and that is absolutely what The Goblin Emperor is. I have heard people raving about this book for years. I know it's won awards, and again, I think that this works for a specific type of reader, which is funny to say because I would not have included myself as that kind of reader prior to December. However, in November, I had picked up A Taste of Golden Iron by Alexandra Rowland, and really loved buddy reading that with my friend Maria. Just the character arcs and the exploration of what it means to be part of the royal family really worked for me. And there were so many comparisons made by reviewers and blurbs that A Taste of Gold and Iron was very similar to Goblin Emperor. And that finally convinced me, between that and Maria's love for Goblin Emperor, I was convinced to finally pick this up and try it in December, and I am so happy I did. Again, this is very character-driven, very slow-paced political fantasy. If that does not work for you, Goblin Emperor will not work for you. So, just know that going in. Maya is the main character. Maya is a half-goblin, half-elven young man who's basically been exiled to the countryside because his father, the emperor, is not particularly fond of him and looks down upon him for being half-goblin. And when an accident takes out everybody in line for the throne except for Maya, everybody in front of Maya who's in line for the throne, he ends up having to go to the elven court and become the new emperor. And Maya is such a cinnamon roll character. Total fish out of water. He hasn't been training for this. There was no expectation he would ever become emperor. And so he really has to figure it out as he goes. He's also dealing with a fair amount of resistance because not only was his father not very fond of him, and therefore the people who have been in power aren't particularly fond of Maya, he's also half goblin. And they are not trusted, and there's a fair amount of racism that's dealt with. There's a fair amount of racism that Maya has to deal with. This is fairly surface level in terms of the racism. I don't think it delves very strongly into it. So if that's the main vibe for you, may or may not appeal to you. I think the main thing to know about this is that the writing style is a bit on the formal side. Addison is really playing around with language and naming, and a lot of the names are fairly similar. Addison does start the story with a Guides for Travelers in the Elflands or something similar to that, that gives you a brief overview on how the naming and the titles work, as well as a little bit on the language, which is very handy because then she immediately just drops you into the story with Maya, and you really figure it out along with Maya, which was a fun element for me. I tend to really like that kind of world building more than I like the really heavy info dumps. So that worked great for me. And again, the real appeal of this is Maya himself, because he's a cinnamon roll character, and I know I've already said that too many times in this short gush about this. But he's really just trying to do his best. He doesn't know anybody yet, so he has to navigate all the court structures, figure out who he can trust and who he can't. But he's just doing the best he can to follow with what his mother had taught him about being a good person and being a good leader, and trying to fit into shoes that he never expected to wear. So I just absolutely adore Maya as a character, and that's what got me through the slow pace and the political elements of it. I wanted to know what was going to happen to Maya, and I loved seeing his arc from this very anxious, scared fish out of water to someone who really had stepped up and learned to be the emperor that the kingdom needed him to be. So I just, again, blew me away that this is this high on this list, but it is a forever favorite, and I'm very happy to have a very pretty copy of it now because I loved it. All right, we are to the top 3 now. Number 3, and again, I'm honestly surprised that this is not number 1, and it is an indication of how great my reading year was in 2022 that it is not number 1. And that is Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I read this in January of 2022, and it stuck with me all the way to the end. And honestly, there is a reason that Hobb is known for her prose. the way that she wrote this story absolutely blew my mind. This is another slow-paced, character-driven story where you're really living in the moment with that main character. Now, there's definitely an argument to be made that Fitz is a very complex and at times not terribly likable character. He does dumb stuff. And I think there's less of it, as far as I understand it, in Assassin's Apprentice because he's a kid. Fitz is the bastard son of a prince of the ruling family, and he ends up being brought into the royal family so that they can watch over him and make sure he's not a threat to them. He ends up being trained as an assassin as a way of further keeping an eye on him and keeping him under control. And you follow Fitz as he grows up and sort of makes this transition from being under the care of, I can't remember if he's a stable master, but he takes care of the horses and the hounds, to being brought in as an apprentice assassin. And the focus is absolutely not on the assassin element. So if that's what's drawing you in, just know going in, this is not focused on the assassin elements. It really is just Fitz growing up and continually being failed by the adults around him because he is in such a sticky situation as the bastard son. He's not terribly accepted by other members in the royal family. He's mistreated by some of the adults around him. It's an emotional roller coaster that you go along with Fitz. Not a ton of plot here, just a lot of being in the moment with Fitz. So if that appeals to you, if Hobb's beautiful prose works for you, then I really can't recommend this highly enough. I actively avoid books described as an emotional roller coaster, and it's probably telling because I have yet to finish, or I have yet to continue on with the Farseer trilogy, which I do intend to do in 2023, but I get fairly emotional with books, so it is very difficult for me to continue on this journey with Fitz because of the highs and the lows, but I also feel very compelled to. So I definitely recommend the Farseer trilogy if you can hang with that, but also get it if that's not your cup of tea. All right, my top two were so difficult to pick between. It was so hard to decide on these because both of them were so good and for vastly different reasons. So I ended up going with A Song for Arbonne by GGK, Guy Gavriel K, as my number 2 favorite of the year. I ended up picking this up because one of my friends, Kristen, from Kristen is Fully Booked, did a read-along of A Song for Arbonne as an excellent starting point to get into GGK's books. I'd heard a lot about some of GGK's other stories, like I know a bunch of people read Tagana. I've heard a lot about Serentine Mosaic, and Lions Valrasan are the ones that I had heard about previously, and I will admit that as someone who doesn't read a ton of historical fiction, which is hilarious because I love reading history, nonfiction, but for whatever reason, historical fiction is hit or miss for me. And someone who doesn't really read a lot of authors who are described as being very literary is kind of a turnoff for me. And the two words that you tend to hear with GGK are literary and very historically influenced, both of which are true. And I was very surprised at how much I immediately fell in love with his writing style. I literally read the prologue for A Song for Arbonne and then went out and bought all his books because that style just worked for me so well. Man, the emotions that I felt in reading A Song for Arbonne, it is classic fantasy. You have the cultured land of Arbonne, which is known for its troubadours and ruled by matriarchs, that is clashing against this militaristic country of Gorholt. And it really dwells on all of the people who are caught in the middle of that and this sort of culture war. And I really loved the epic nature of this story. And I love GGK's prose. It really, really works for me. I know there were some people during the read-along who didn't enjoy that style as much. It is sort of a more formal, somewhat removed perspective. There are multiple point of views, like quite a few, that GGK uses to give you this broader picture of both societies, which I absolutely adored. But it's not quite as character driven in the sense that a lot more modern fantasy is, where you're living in the moment with some of these characters. There's a bit of distance there. It did remind me quite a bit of Tolkien, with a lot less emphasis on the details and more of sort of an immersive, all senses feel to it. I don't know if I'm explaining that in a way that makes perfect sense, but I just found it, with GGK's style, I felt like I was there with the characters in a way that I haven't found too many authors who can replicate, including Tolkien. For me, Tolkien is someone telling this epic story to me. For me, GGK is me being part of that story, if that distinction makes sense. So it is super atmospheric. I freaking loved some of the epic moments in this. I obviously can't say what some of them are because I don't want to spoil anything, but I will just say that Song for Arbonne has some of my favorite tropes done brilliantly, and all of these moments with the various characters that just spoke to me and made it a favorite of all time. I definitely would put this on my list of top fantasy standalones because I loved it so much, and I am so excited to be continuing on with GGK's works in 2023. Okay, we have finally made it to my number one pick for 2022. Honestly, if you've watched my channel much at all, been around me much at all, because I never shut up about this series, this is no surprise. It is Harrow the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, which is the second book in the Locked Tomb series. I read Gideon for the very first time in, I think, October to December of 2021. I then read Gideon 3 separate times this year, and Harrow is the book that I didn't think I could possibly love as much as I love Gideon. And somehow, Muir did it. Because Harrow picks up after the events of Gideon the Ninth. I am not going to be getting into plot details because I don't want to spoil anything if you haven't read that series before. My boyfriend has described this series as Tumblr, but make it slightly Warhammer-ish. I think that's a perfect explanation of the series. I think it's better than the focus on lesbian necromancers, because it is necromancers in space, but the romantic element definitely is not the focus for this series. The focus for this series is the snark. It is the piecemeal world building that you get that you can only figure out after you've read the books a couple different times. The almost pretentious writing style that Muir has, it is not going to be for everybody. Just know that going in. If you do not enjoy Gideon, you might enjoy Harrow, because I think it takes a different tone than Gideon did, and you're following a slightly different characters. It may or may not work for you if you didn't like Gideon. If you don't like Gideon or Harrow, don't continue with the series, because I don't think it'll work for you. But when I picked up Harrow the very first time, I was so confused. Harrow takes everything you thought you knew about Gideon and upends it. And you have to keep reading. You don't figure out what's going on until 2/3 of the way in. And so it really is a matter of just hanging with it and seeing where Muir is taking this. And I loved it. I think I benefited a lot when I reread it because I finally could make some of those connections once I knew what was happening. So I really, really think The Locked Tomb is a series that you can reread many times and get more out of. There's a ton of meme references in this, even more so than in Gideon, so if you didn't like that in Gideon, that doesn't stop. And I think what blew my mind the most about Harrow the Ninth is that I didn't actually like Harrow very much in Gideon. She's kind of an asshole, to be perfectly honest. And I didn't think that Muir could make me love Harrow as much as I loved Gideon, and I was wrong. Harrow the Ninth is this giant puzzle of a book, and for me, it completely won me over on Harrow as a person. You really get to see a full picture of why she is the prickly jerk that she is, and what really drives her, and sort of her path forward. And I just, again, I love The Locked Tomb with all of my heart. It is one of my favorite series of all time. I'm not sure I can pick very many that I would put over it. It is for a very specific type of reader. Not everybody is going to like The Locked Tomb, and that's fine. We can still be friends, even if you hate it. But I absolutely adore it. There was very little chance that anything was going to beat Harrow for this top read of the year because of my love for the series overall, and it's a series I expect to keep reading as time goes by. I did not, unfortunately, love Nona as much as I loved Gideon and Harrow, so I'll be very interested to see with the final installment, Electo the Ninth, how I feel by the time we get there, and how I feel in future rereads. So that is my top 10 list. Let me know if you have read any of these books, what you thought of them. Hopefully I have not been too rambly for you. I know this is going to be on the long side because I can't help it. Let me know what any of your top reads for 2022 are. I absolutely adore seeing what everybody's best and worst of the year are, just because it's so fun to hear people talk about what they love. And I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!